In our last session, we stepped back onto our rice paper road and started to very gently and very carefully maneuver onto this question of where does Israel fit into end times thinking. I shared that in my experience, I see many Christians who get very passionate on this subject and can also become quite judgmental and start saying, if you don't believe my interpretation of this, then you're wrong and you're somehow heretical. And we lose a lot of grace and love towards each other. And as we consider some of these questions, I'm sure that those of us listening to this have a very different heart, a very different attitude. And we recognise, just as we did when we looked at the Antichrist, that we're trying to interpret something and understand something. But if you're in any doubt about Israel still being part of that end times thinking, let's just pick up some of what the Bible says. In Jeremiah 30, we read that there are times of trouble for my people Israel, yet in the end they will be saved. In Ezekiel 20, we see that it says there will be a time of judgment for Israel. And in Ezekiel 22, he prophesies that Israel will be put through the crucible, this refining of God's judgment. We see that again in Zechariah 13 and Malachi chapter 3. And in Daniel chapter 12, it's quite clear that there will be a time of trouble for Israel. Clearly, the Bible is repeatedly identifying that within this tribulation, within this end times, there is a specific focus on the people of Israel. When Jesus is speaking in Matthew 24, he says that for the sake of the elect, these times are going to be cut short. And he uses a word there for elect in verses 22 and verse 31. There's also found in Deuteronomy 14, where it talks about Israel as the chosen possession of God. Where does the church fit into all of this? There are many varied and different views about where Israel and the church fit into the end times. But clearly the Bible shows a focus on Israel, a focus on Jerusalem. But when we read verses like Jesus speaking about the elect, and he's talking to his disciples, where many times through the rest of the New Testament, when Jesus is speaking through Matthew, his teaching is applied to all believers. And then we come to Matthew 24, and suddenly we begin to ask ourselves the question, is this for all believers or just for Israel? When Jesus uses words like elect, is he talking about Israel or all believers? And when you take the whole picture into account of the whole book, you find yourself asking some of these questions. In Romans chapters 9 to 11, Paul has a big discussion on Israel, and he unpacks in incredible sort of complexity God's purposes for Israel. He discusses their unbelief and he discusses their rejection of Jesus. And there's a big focus within there of where the Jewish nation, the people of Israel, still fit within the purposes of God. But in chapter 11 and verses 17 to 21, he talks about the Gentiles who are non-Jews being ingrafted branches. And the picture we have is of a vine. A vine is regularly used through the Bible as a picture of a nation of Israel. And the picture Paul gives us is that those of us who aren't Jews have been grafted in like a cutting into the vine, where like a gardening term used, where these branches become part of the original plant. When we read passages like Romans 11 and we read about us being engrafted branches, it poses the question that when we read passages like Revelation, is it referring to the nation of Israel, the people? Is it relating to the nation of Israel, the geography? Or does it relate to the church? This brings us to a very interesting question, and one which we're not going to solve here very easily. There are very differing views on how this is to be interpreted. There are many differing views when you read Revelation 6 to 20, of whether this relates to the whole church or to Israel. But one of the things that is pointed out is that when you start reading Revelation and you read through all of the end times teaching from Revelation 6 to Revelation 20, the church is not referred to. But you regularly see reference to believers in Jesus being martyred and the people of God. Revelation 14 verse 12 says that God's people must endure persecution. The dilemma we have is whether this relates to the whole church or just Jerusalem. This is an area of controversy for us, but it's not the only area that we have to contend with.